Have you ever believed that sometimes death doesn't come from the barrel of a gun or the edge of a knife, but from the laughter of a crowd? A laughter so sharp it cuts to the bone, so merciless it turns a living soul into nothing more than entertainment. Out here on the frontier, where the land itself can break the strongest of men. There is still something colder than the wind or the burning sun, public humiliation, when an entire town turns its back on one person's suffering. Before I take you any further, let me pause for just a moment. If these opening words tighten something in your chest, if you've ever seen, or even felt, what it's like for the weak to be made a spectacle, hit that like button to keep these frontier stories alive. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from, maybe a breezy porch out in the country, or a quiet little room tucked away in the city. I promise you this, if you stay with me until the end, you'll understand why a single afternoon in Dusthaven changed 2 lives forever. That evening, the sun had dropped low, stretching shadows long across the main street of Dusthaven. Dust swirled in the wind, clinging to hems and boots, slipping under collars. Folks crowded the saloon porch, bottles in hand, laughter loud and reckless. It wasn't laughter born of joy, it was the kind that thrives on cruelty. At the center of it all stood Nayeli, a young Apache woman, her wrists bound cruelly behind her back, her body stiff, though her heart pounded like a trapped bird. No one spoke her name. To them, she was just the Indian girl caught near a cornfield. They accused her of stealing, of taking what she had no right to touch. Not one person asked why she was starving, why her eyes looked hollow, why her frame trembled with hunger. They didn't care. They only wanted a reason to play their game. A shopkeeper swaggered forward with a polished red apple, buffed shiny against his vest. With a smirk, he tipped her chin up and set the apple carefully atop her head, as though arranging a circus trick. "Let's see who's got the steadiest hand," he jeered, and the crowd howled with approval. Another voice called out, "If they miss, so what might be better than hanging her?" The noise rolled and clashed, cruel and cutting. Nayeli didn't move. She knew that if she faltered, if she flinched, the laughter would only grow sharper, heavier. The rope dug deep into her wrists, drawing blood, but she kept her chin high. Inside, she felt a storm fear, shame, rage. Worst of all was the humiliation. Shame for being displayed, mocked, treated as less than human. Shame that no one asked if she had any reason but desperation. The last light of day fell across her face, highlighting the dirt, the lines of exhaustion. And yet, in that moment, there was something else defiance. The kind born of having nothing left to lose but dignity. She refused to cry. Tears would only delight them more. Instead, she bit her lip until she tasted blood, holding herself still. From the crowd came whistles, catcalls, the hollow bang of hands slapping bottles, the rising chant, "Shoot, shoot." The street had become a stage, and she was nothing more than a living target. To anyone who had lived long enough on the borderlands, this scene was all too familiar, a small, closed community, binding itself together with cruelty, laughter clashing with the rattle of glass, the distant echo of hooves, all swirling into a single, merciless rhythm. At the center of that rhythm stood Nayeli, silent, her heart hammering in her ears. Her thoughts darted to the family she'd lost, to the tribe that had cast her aside, to the endless days of hunger that had driven her to steal. And now the price for survival was this being offered up as sport. The moment grew unbearable. Every laugh sliced deeper, every sneer stripped away another layer of her humanity. And when the first man raised his gun, sighting down at the apple perched above her head, the world seemed to pause, dust hanging, breath held, silence roaring. And in that silence, the true story began. Because no one expected that from the edge of the crowd. One man would step forward, a man scarred by his own past, a man who had promised himself never to interfere again, a man who would do the one thing that turned the entire town of Dusthaven to stone silence. And from the crack of that gunshot, nothing would ever be the same for Nayeli, or for Jonas Hale. Have you ever seen a moment when a crowd, loud with jeers and laughter, suddenly falls silent as if the very air itself had been split in two? Just one unexpected act, one solitary man stepping out of the shadows, can shift the fate of another. In Dusthaven that evening, such a moment arrived, and every laugh died like smoke on the wind. The gunshot cracked, sharp and final, cutting across the street. The bright red apple on Nayeli's head burst apart, falling into the dust in wet fragments. For a heartbeat, all of Dusthaven froze. The townsfolk stared at one another, uncertain whether to cheer the marksmanship or gape at the man who had fired. For no one expected Jonas Hale, the reclusive drifter who lived far outside town, to step into the circle and pull the trigger. Jonas lowered his revolver with calm precision, every motion measured. He didn't grin, didn't boast. The brim of his sweat-stained hat shadowed most of his face, leaving only the sharp set of his jaw, scarred from some long-ago fight. Everyone in Dusthaven knew Jonas, or at least knew enough to keep their distance. He was a man apart. No gambling, no whiskey, no gatherings, just a cabin, a few cattle, and silence. Yet here he was, breaking that silence in the boldest way possible. For a moment the crowd shuffled, unsure how to respond. Then a voice barked out, half mocking, half nervous. "Fine shot. Hale, she's yours now." The laughter returned, ragged and uneasy. Some hooted, pretending it was still a game. Jonas didn't so much as glance their way. He slid the pistol back into its holster, reached for the knife at his belt, and stepped toward Nayeli. She stiffened, flinching as the blade flashed, certain he meant harm. But in one clean motion, he cut through the ropes biting into her wrists. The cords dropped to the ground, leaving angry red welts in their wake. She flexed her fingers, stunned, scarcely able to believe she was free. Without a word, Jonas laid a steady hand on her arm, not tight, not rough, simply guiding. "Come," he muttered, his voice low and even. Nayeli's legs trembled, but instinct carried her forward. Better to follow this stranger than to remain in the hands of a laughing mob. The crowd muttered, restless. A few jeered Hales taking himself an Indian bride. Others spat the word crazy. But none stepped in his path. Perhaps it was the cold fire in Jonas's eyes when he turned, or the weight of a soldier's steadiness in his stance. Whatever it was, no one dared block him. Together they walked, the circle of onlookers parting in sullen silence. Jonas's boots ground in the dirt. Nayeli's bare feet stumbled in his wake, past the saloon, past the general store. Out through the last weather-worn buildings of Dusthaven, they never looked back. Jonas knew what he had done wasn't the end of trouble. It was the beginning. In towns like this, shaming a man before his neighbors was an insult that would fester. Beside him, Nayeli moved like a ghost. Her wrists bled, her breath rasped, and every step seemed borrowed from her last reserve of strength. She didn't know where he meant to take her, or what his true intentions were. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was no longer their spectacle. No one laughed at her now. The farther they went, the harsher the wind grew, sweeping dust across the valley. Jonas kept his stride long and steady. When he glanced back, he saw her struggling to match his pace, hair plastered to her cheeks with sweat and grit. Without comment, he slowed. Their silence wasn't cruel, like the crowd's had been. It was a thin, fragile veil stretched between two strangers, bound by a single, impossible moment. Behind them, Dusthaven's noise still echoed faintly, but it faded with every step. Nayeli's chest burned, but her eyes flickered with something fierce and new life, still hers, still burning. And in that strange mixture of surprise and unease, both she and Jonas knew they had crossed a line they could never return from. Have you ever lived through a night where even the whisper of wind through branches made your heart jolt, where the darkness outside didn't just hide danger, but stirred every doubt you carried inside for Nayeli and Jonas Hale? That first night after leaving Dusthaven was exactly that, a long, uneasy stretch of hours filled with watchfulness, where neither knew if they could trust the other, or if they were only sharing the same patch of sky until dawn returned. They stopped by a narrow creek where cottonwoods stood close together, their gray-green branches breaking the bite of the wind. Water rushed cold and clear, catching the faint shimmer of a thin moon overhead. Jonas dropped his saddlebag to the dirt. His stance was rigid, his gaze sharp, like a wolf that had never known rest. Nayeli stayed back a few paces, arms wrapped tight across her chest, still trembling from all that had happened. Jonas set to building a fire. His movements were slow, practiced those of a man who had done this countless times in years of solitude. A match flared, casting a fleeting red glow across his face, highlighting the scar that cut from his jaw to his neck. The fire caught on dry grass, then licked upward through sticks until a steady flame pushed warmth against the chill. He pulled a strip of jerky from his bag and held it out. At first, Nayeli shook her head, eyes clouded with suspicion. In her memory, food offered by others had not always meant mercy, but hunger gnawed at her harder than mistrust. Hesitantly, she reached out, her fingers brushing his rough hand before pulling back. She chewed small bites, wary, as though afraid someone might rip it away. Jonas didn't stare at her, didn't press. He sat with his eyes on the fire, shoulders set. When she swallowed, he poured water into a tin cup and set it on the ground between them. Nayeli hesitated, then lifted it, drinking deep until water spilled down her chin. For the first time in days, her throat eased. She looked up, and in a brief flicker, their eyes met his calm, hers uncertain, but neither turned away at once. Jonas unrolled a blanket and tossed it toward her. Nayeli flinched. Instinct braced for a trick. His words were low. Even take it. Not harsh, not tender, just steady. The way a man speaks when he isn't used to many words. She gathered the coarse wool around her shoulders, and warmth seeped slowly into her skin, for the first time since the afternoon's humiliation. She no longer shivered violently. They sat on opposite sides of the fire, their shadows stretching long in the dust, the sound of the creek threading between them. The silence was heavy, not mocking, like the crowd's had been, but the silence of two strangers not yet certain of each other. Jonas worked his revolver with practiced ease, wiping it down, eyes flicking now and then to the tree line. A man who had seen war knew danger often struck when you thought yourself safe. Nayeli curled tighter beneath the blanket, wide-eyed, watching every flicker of movement in the brush. Each snap of a twig, each drip of water, made her jolt. The jeers of Dusthaven still rang in her ears, the memory of laughter sharper than any knife. Yet here, no one jeered. No rope bound her wrists, and the man across the fire, though strange, though frightening in his silence, had not raised a hand against her. Time dragged. At last, Jonas lay back, hat tipped low, his revolver close within reach. He hadn't said he would guard her, but the gesture spoke for itself. Nayeli shifted to the ground with the blanket drawn tight. Her eyes stayed on him. Part fear, part something else, an unsteady sense of safety she didn't dare name. Without his bullet, she might already have been lying dead in the dirt of the main street. That knowledge clung close. Her lashes drooped at last. She whispered something in her native tongue, too faint for Jonas to catch, carried off by the night wind. Not a plea, not a curse, but the voice of someone who had lost nearly everything, yet still breathed. Jonas stirred, glancing over. She had finally drifted into a restless sleep, her breathing steadier now. He closed his eyes too, one hand still resting near the revolver, not because he distrusted her, but because the world beyond their fire had never given him reason to relax. That night, beneath a sky scattered with stars, by a creek running cold and strange, two souls, one mocked by a town, one hardened by solitude, shared the same fire. Neither trusted fully. Neither spoke more than a word, but both knew one thing: if they meant to keep living, they had to make it through this night together. Have you ever noticed how silence inside a house can carry two very different weights? It can be a hollow kind of emptiness, where every gust slipping through the cracks feels like proof of loneliness. But it can also be a blanket, soft and steady, wrapping around the soul and telling you that for now, you are safe. That was what began to take shape between Jonas Hale and Nayeli when they reached his cabin, tucked against the ridge and half swallowed by weeds and dust. The path there was rough, scarred with old wagon ruts and patches of mud. Jonas walked steady, his horse trailing behind. Nayeli kept her distance close enough not to be left behind, far enough not to feel cornered. When the cabin finally came into view, it looked like little more than a shack-tin sheets patched the roof. Gray timbers sagged from weather, the yard cluttered with broken harness, splintered rails, and an axe rusting deep in a stump. To a stranger, it was nothing but a poor man's shelter. To Jonas, it was the only place he could call his own. He opened the door and stepped aside. Nayeli's eyes flicked over the dark interior, weighing whether stepping through that threshold meant freedom or another trap. Jonas didn't press. He only nodded once, leaving the choice to her. After a long pause, she walked inside. The room was bare, a square table with two chairs, a narrow bed pushed to the wall, a cast-iron stove crouched in the corner. Smoke, leather, and dust mingled in the air. It wasn't much, but to someone who had been bound and mocked in the street, even this space felt closer to freedom. Jonas set his bag down, lit the stove, and poured a handful of beans into a pot with water, when the smell filled the air. Nayeli's stomach growled loud enough the color flushed her cheeks. Jonas said nothing, only slid a tin bowl across the table. She hesitated, still cautious, then reached out. Her hand trembled as she lifted it. But when she tasted the food, her eyes stung not with grief, but with relief. For the first time in days, she ate without being laughed at. Name, Jonas asked, voice low and spare. She blinked, then touched her chest. Nayeli, she said, the word thick with accent. Jonas gave a small nod. Jonas, nothing more. But in that exchange, a thin thread of connection tightened between them. The next days changed the cabin in small, quiet ways. Each morning Jonas split wood or walked the fence line, and when he returned, he found that Nayeli had swept the corners, cleared dust from the table, or stacked clutter neatly by the wall. She found one of his old shirts folded away, smoothed her hands across the fabric, then folded it again with more care than he ever had. It was as though by touching each object, she was proving to herself that she was no longer a prisoner. One afternoon, Jonas hammered a rail back into place and glanced up. She stood in the doorway, the old blanket loose around her shoulders, arms crossed against the wind. She didn't smile, didn't speak, only watched. Her gaze no longer held only fear. There was something else now, something closer to acceptance. For the first time in years, Jonas felt the yard carry more than just the echo of his hammer. At night, the silence inside grew less harsh. They still spoke little, But the quiet no longer cut like it once did. It became a shelter of its own, a space to rest weary spirits. They shared beans from the same pot, water from the same cup. Sometimes Nayeli tried English words, water. Fire, thank you. Jonas repeated them, his voice rough but patient. Each word she learned laid another stone on the path toward trust. Jonas still laid his blanket near the stove for her, taking the bed himself. But she no longer curled tight in suspicion as she had by the creek. Now she lay steady, breath even, sleep coming easier. And in the dark, Jonas lay awake a while, realizing the room no longer felt so hollow. Her presence had turned silence into something strong enough to lean on, day by day. The sharp edges of fear dulled, replaced by something neither had known in a long time: safety. In that weathered cabin. Two people who had begun as strangers started weaving the first threads of trust, not with promises, but with small, human acts: a bowl of beans, a shared blanket, a table wiped clean, and a silence that no longer demanded shame. Have you ever sat with someone in silence and felt it grow so heavy that it almost forced you to speak truths you had buried for years? That was what happened to Jonas Hale and Nayeli on those storm-heavy nights in the cabin. Outside, rain hammered the patched tin roof, streams running down the warped shutters. Inside, the fire glowed in the cast iron stove, throwing a soft light against rough wooden walls. Jonas sat in a worn chair, honing his hunting knife, while Nayeli wrapped a blanket tight around her shoulders, knees drawn close to the hearth. Her damp hair clung to her cheeks, her dark eyes fixed on the flames. At first neither spoke. Both were used to silence. Then thunder rolled deep and low, and Nayeli turned her head. She hesitated, then asked in halting English, "Why? You alone?" The words were simple, but they struck straight to the place Jonas kept locked tight. He set the knife down, his scarred hands curling into fists. It had been years since anyone asked him such a thing. But her eyes wary, searching, carrying hurt that mirrored his own, made it impossible to turn away. "Lost people," he said slowly. "War took some time. Took the rest. Easier to be alone than to bury more." His voice was gravel, low and raw. Nayeli went still. She didn't need every word to understand. The weight in his tone was enough. Her gaze softened, and she gave the smallest nod, as if to say she knew that kind of pain. After a pause, she whispered her own truth. Words broken but clear enough: family. Gone. Tribe. No more. Hunger. I steal. Shame. Each word cut rough, but it was a story whole in itself. Jonas looked at her. Her eyes burned with both shame and defiance. She wasn't begging, wasn't weeping. She was placing her truth between them, as naked as his. He drew a deep breath. In that moment, the distance between them shrank. No longer rescuer and rescued, just two fractured lives, recognizing the scars in each other. "You're safe here," Jonas said. The words came awkward, but firm. For Nayeli, they landed like a shield. Her gaze caught his, a faint light flickering there, and then she gave one slow nod. Silence followed, but it no longer weighed them down. It carried warmth, sympathy. The fire crackled, the rain pressed against the roof, and they sat closer without thinking about it. Nayeli clutched the blanket, her hand trembling on the table's edge. Jonas felt the old walls inside him strain. He had spent years building them, but her gaze unguarded, fragile, and strong all at once split them wider. He leaned slightly toward her, then stopped, waiting. If she turned away, it would end there. She didn't. Her dark eyes widened, her breath quickened, but she did not retreat. In a voice rough with hesitation, he asked, "May I?" She didn't understand every word, but she caught the meaning. Her lips parted, and she gave the faintest nod. Their lips met, tentative, careful, like a first step on uncertain ground. Jonas's heart pounded. Nayeli trembled, yet didn't pull back. Instead, her hand rose, pressing lightly against his chest as if searching for the beat beneath his worn shirt. When they parted, the cabin still glowed with firelight, but the world was altered. Words failed them both. Jonas lowered his brow to hers, exhaling, while Nayeli closed her eyes for a moment as though to hold the memory in place. Neither slept quickly that night. The storm raged. Wind hissed through the cracks, but inside the cabin, silence no longer felt like a wall. It had become a fragile bridge, spanning two wounded hearts, and from that bridge, a bond began not born of promises or grand gestures, but of a single phrase. "You're safe here. Have you ever heard the sound of hooves coming from far off and known? Without doubt. That trouble was on its way. Not the steady trot of a trader, not the easy gait of a neighbor, but the hard, urgent pounding of men carrying liquor and grudges. On a gray morning outside the cabin, Jonas Hale heard it, and he knew Dust Haven wasn't finished. The fire in the stove was still warm when 3 dust trails rose from the valley floor. Jonas had been mending a hinge on the cattle pen, hammer in hand, when his eyes narrowed. He recognized the riders by the way they leaned in their saddles' faces he'd seen in the crowd, laughing when Nayeli was bound. Straightening, he scanned the horizon, then turned toward the cabin. In the half-open doorway, Nayeli stood clutching a blanket, her gaze shifting uneasily. Jonas stepped inside, lifted the Winchester from its hooks. His voice was flat. "Steady men coming." He gestured with his hand to be sure she understood. Her face went pale for a moment, but only for a moment. When he said sharply, "Stay inside. Don't open the door." She shook her head hard. Her dark eyes burned, and the answer came in broken but fierce English. "No hide." Jonas froze. He'd known women and children to cower, to let the men stand the line. But in her eyes, trembling though her body was, there was fire. She would not bend. After a pause, he gave one short nod. No argument, no orders. The hooves pounded closer, shaking the ground beneath their feet. Nayeli stepped out from the doorway, gripping a kitchen knife in both hands. The blanket slid from her shoulders. Her hair whipped wild in the wind. Jonas planted himself on the porch, Winchester leveled across the yard. The riders reined up hard, mud splattering. The one in front, a red-eyed brute with a bald forehead, grinned wide. "Hale, you think you can make fools of us in front of the whole town and not pay for it?" He jerked his chin at Nayeli. "That girl ain't yours. She's ours to use, to break." Jonas's face didn't move. "She ain't yours," he said, voice low, cold. The barrel of his rifle held steady. The men cackled. One drew his Colt, wagging it loose in his hand. "You don't have the guts. Hale, hand her over, and we'll walk away." The air tightened like a drawn wire. The fence creaked in the wind, dust curling under hooves. Behind him, Jonas heard Nayeli's breath quick and sharp, and strangely, it steadied him. His finger tightened on the trigger. "Last warning," Jonas said, voice like steel. The leader sneered, lifting his pistol. In that split breath, Jonas fired. The Winchester roared, echoing across the valley. The man toppled from his saddle, clutching his bleeding shoulder, screaming as his horse reared. The other 2 cursed. One fired wild. A bullet ripping a line across the cabin roof. Jonas dropped to a knee, chambered another round, and shot again. A hat flew into the dirt. A horse spun in panic. The third rider yanked his reins and fled, kicking up a trail of dust as he disappeared over the ridge. The wounded man staggered back onto his horse, hate burning in his eyes, before lurching away after the others. Silence settled, heavier than the laughter had ever been. Jonas lowered the rifle slowly, chest heaving. When he turned, Nayeli was still there, knife clenched in her hand, her whole body trembling, but her chin was high. "You see," she said, her voice shaky but fierce. "No hide." Jonas stared at her, then gave a small, grim nod. "No hide." They stepped back into the cabin, closing the door behind them. The air inside was thick with smoke and the raw edge of fear. Jonas set the rifle on the table, his hand trembling faintly though his eyes had softened. Nayeli laid the knife down, her breath ragged, but her gaze bright as firelight. He knew it wasn't over. Men like that didn't forget, and Dusthaven would not forgive being shamed. But in that moment, Jonas understood one thing: he wasn't standing alone anymore. The woman who refused to hide would fight beside him, and together they would face whatever storm came next. Outside, the wind whipped dust into the valley, the land holding its breath. Inside, amid the smell of gunpowder and wood smoke, two people stood bound not by fear, but by a choice tested in gunfire. Have you ever realized that sometimes the smallest decision, just two simple words, can change the course of an entire life for Jonas Hale and Nayeli after the gunfire of that night? The words "we stay" became the red thread binding two people who once had nothing left. The morning after the clash, mist hung over the valley. Hoofprints and dark stains of blood still marked the earth outside the cabin. Jonas stood on the porch, the Winchester resting inside on the table, his eyes tracing the tracks until the rising sun swallowed them. Inside, Nayeli cleared away tin bowls from their meager meal, her slender hands moving steady now, no longer shaking. Jonas thought to tell her they should leave, abandon the cabin, strike deeper into the country where Dusthaven's grudges couldn't reach. But when he stepped back inside, he found her sitting at the rough-hewn table, lifting her gaze straight into his. It wasn't the look of fear anymore. It was choice. Her voice, halting, but sure, said, "We stay." Jonas stopped cold, his chest tightened not from dread, but from the weight of her resolve. He placed a weathered hand on the chair and sat opposite her. For a long breath, silence pressed between them. Then he nodded, his own voice rough. "We stay." Those words shifted the air inside the cabin. It was no longer just a shelter. It was the beginning of a home. Nayeli saw in Jonas's eyes a man she could trust. Jonas saw in hers not a burden, but a partner. The days that followed became proof of their decision. Jonas drove nails into split rails, the echo of his hammer ringing against the ridge, while Nayeli steadied the boards and handed him nails with clumsy but determined fingers. They didn't need long speeches, only the passing of tools. A nod, a glance. By evening, sweat soaked their shirts, but they sat together on the porch steps, watching the valley glow with the setting sun. Nayeli's shoulder brushed his, and this time he didn't move away. Dusthaven's shadow still lingered out there. But in that moment, it felt far off. Inside, small changes took root. The kitchen no longer smelled only of beans and stale bread. One afternoon, Nayeli tried her hand at baking, clumsy but patient, flour dusting her cheek. Jonas, who had eaten in silence for years, let out a deep, unexpected laugh at the sight. Nayeli laughed too, soft but real. That sound warmed the cabin more than the fire. One morning, they walked together behind the cabin. Jonas handed her a hoe he had mended, side by side. They broke soil, dropped seeds, covered them with earth. Dirt streaked their boots, blisters rose on their palms, yet their faces carried something almost like hope. For Jonas, each furrow meant he was no longer just surviving. For Nayeli, each seed meant she would not be turned away hungry again. At night, the fire burned low. They sat closer now, no longer across the room but shoulder to shoulder. Words were few, but the silence carried comfort. Jonas found himself repeating inwardly the vow he had spoken aloud. "We stay." And to those of you listening, Perhaps you've known that feeling the day you stop wandering, the day you look at someone and say, "I'll stay," no matter the storm. It isn't fleeting romance. It is a quiet covenant, etched into every shared chore, every nail driven, every seed planted, in that lonely valley. After gunfire and blood, a new kind of household was forming. No law handed it to them. No crowd granted it. They chose it. They chose each other. And sometimes, friends. That is the strongest beginning of all. Have you ever seen a place that once was nothing more than 4 lonely walls suddenly turn into a home? Simply because another heartbeat began to fill it. Jonas Hale's cabin had been just that, a shack of silence, with nothing but the sound of an axe on wood and the wind sighing through the cracks. But after the choice of "we stay," it began, day by day, to change. It became something more than shelter. It became life itself. Spring swept through the valley. Snowmelt ran clear in the creeks. Young grass pushed green through the earth, and the sky stretched wide and blue. Each morning, Jonas and Nayeli stepped into the garden plot behind the cabin. With hoe and spade they turned the soil, planting seeds they had carefully saved. The ground that once lay barren slowly lined itself with furrows. Blisters formed on Nayeli's palms, reddening her fingers, but she did not complain. When the first tender shoots pushed through, her eyes shone as though her own heart had sprouted new life after a long winter. Inside the cabin, she tended every corner. She swept away the dust, scrubbed the old blanket clean, folded Jonas's shirts neatly, and learned to make meals out of the meager supplies: beans, flour, a scrap of lard. The first time she baked, flour streaked her cheek, and the table was covered white. Jonas, coming in from the corral, stopped in his tracks and laughed a deep, rough laugh he had not felt in years. Nayeli blinked, startled, then laughed too, light and clear, and in that sound the cabin glowed warmer than any fire. At night, they sat by the hearth. Jonas, once so guarded, began teaching her words in English: water, bread, home. She repeated them over and over, her accent thick but determined. Each time she spoke more clearly. Jonas nodded, and her face lit with triumph. Then one evening, when the fire cast its glow across her dark eyes, she whispered haltingly, "You my home." The words were clumsy, but they struck Jonas silent. He had never thought of himself as anyone's home. But in that moment, the armor around his heart eased, and he felt the truth of it. To those listening, perhaps you know that feeling. After years of loss, when hair has grayed and time has hardened us, we no longer long for riches or crowds. We long only for a place to belong, for someone to call our own. For Jonas and Nayeli, what once seemed impossible was now alive and breathing in that cabin. There were evenings when they sat on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the ridge. They said little, but the silence was no longer heavy. It was the silence of peace, the kind that comes when you know the person beside you will still be there, come morning. Nayeli leaned lightly against Jonas's shoulder. His hand rested over hers. No vows were spoken, but the warmth said more than words ever could. And so, spring brought rebirth. Jonas, who had once resigned himself to die alone, smiled again. Nayeli, who had been treated as an object to mock, now stood tall, cooking, planting, learning, becoming. 2 lost souls were shaping themselves into a family by choice. Friends, as you hear this story, I invite you to reflect how many times in your own life have you longed for safety, for a hand reaching back to yours, for someone to whisper. You're safe here. Jonas and Nayeli found it in the harshest of places, and they hold it now in the quiet work of each day. So what lies ahead for them? Perhaps they will turn that small garden into a true farm. Perhaps one day the cabin will echo not only with their voices, but with the laughter of children. Or perhaps the shadows of Dusthaven will rise again, testing them once more. But this time, they will face it side by side. And that, friends, is the truth of these frontier stories. It is not just the gunfire or the danger that lingers. It is the moment two people choose to remain with the land, with life, with each other. Jonas and Nayeli have already made that choice. So I ask you to stand with them. Believe, as they do, that from ashes a home can rise, that from loneliness a family can grow. Let their story remind us all sometimes the greatest act is not to run, but to stay. Sometimes the strongest vow is the simplest we stay.